Let's go now to Shadow Minister for Immigration and Citizenship, Dan Tehan. There's lots around, Dan. I'll get to some of your portfolio issues for a moment, but you are in the House today. You were there for those extraordinary scenes. I made mention at the top of the show, I've never seen anything like it in the Parliament about something as sombre as what that motion was supposed to represent, let alone a split like this in foreign policy terms. I can't understand why the government could not support a simple motion regarding that day, October 7, and what occurred to innocent Israelis.
No, I can't either, Peter, and no one on the coalition side could as well. It was, I think, a day of shame for our parliament. The fact that we couldn't reach a bipartisan agreement on the fact that we needed to be paying our respects to the 1,200 Israelis who lost their lives from that heinous attack, the fact that there are 100 hostages still being held by a listed terrorist organisation, Hamas, and stand with Israel on this day, I think is a day of shame. And the Prime Minister, I think, needs to clearly explain what it was in that wording of the motion that Peter Dutton put forward in a bipartisan way that he so vehemently disagreed with, because there is nothing in that wording that should have prevented the Prime Minister standing with us on that motion. And Peter Dutton wrote to the Prime Minister. He was quite prepared for him to lead on this. And the Prime Minister once again showed that he just isn't up to leading. And in the end, it was Peter Dutton that put forward the motion. And when he read it out in the Parliament and you listened to it, you could not find one word in that motion that the Labor Party should not have been able to agree with.
Dan, you were in the Parliament. I was there too when we were dealing with issues like Osama bin Laden. There was no sitting on the fence about Al-Qaeda. There was no sitting on the fence about the women, the Yazidi women on Mount Sinjar, and all the ramifications, the horrific depravity we saw from Islamic State. It's a bloody big call for Peter Dutton to have done what he did today. I mean, that takes a lot of courage. But it says to me as I watched it unfold, and I listened to the Prime Minister first, obviously, I had no idea what the coalition might do. I was outraged at where the Prime Minister was going in his motion. But for Dutton to get up and do what he did, I thought to myself, that is a measure of the man that you will get as Prime Minister if he wins the next election. I think Australians tonight watching this will probably come to that same conclusion.
Absolutely. It was incredibly courageous what Peter Dutton did today, because he stood up for what is morally right. He stood up on principle, and he also stood up on what has been the heritage of the Parliament on issues when it comes to Israel. As Peter Dutton himself mentioned, this goes back to Julia Gillard, to Kevin Rudd, to Paul Keating, to Bob Hawke. They were able to stand with the coalition in a bipartisan way on these issues. And the fact that that couldn't be done today, I think, is just a damning indictment on the Prime Minister. And none of us wanted to see it. That's the thing.
No,
we all wanted to come
clear
here today and to be able to, recognise the atrocities which occurred on October 7. And you're right to point to ISIS, a listed terrorist organisation. People seem to forget Hamas are a listed terrorist organisation. And I say this, Peter, could you imagine if this attack had taken place in Australia and 100 hostages were still being held, Australians being held as hostages? Do you think there would be the Australian people would want equivalence? Do you think that they would want some sort of understanding? They would want their government to take action against the terrorist organisation that has committed this.
I remember when we were deploying assets into the theatre of Islamic State. We didn't have, obviously, troops on the ground, but we had assets in the theatre. We were doing training in Iraq. We had special forces nearby in case they were needed, obviously, for evacuations. But I remember the sort of very sombre meetings. Tony Abbott had as Prime Minister with Bill Shorten, who was opposition leader. And Shorten moved the Labor left. I mean, the right were there already, but he moved the Labor left a huge distance to support urgent legislation, to support deployments. We gave briefings, you know, in the early hours of the morning. We did everything to accommodate keeping the bipartisanship while we had troops overseas, while we had these issues that we were contending with. We remember, of course, all that radicalisation that was also happening back in Australia. And I look at what's happening here in the Parliament. It's never been more divided, Dan. And we've never had more division on the streets in Australia as a consequence, because the Parliament is divided. The two major parties are divided because the Prime Minister himself is divided. He cannot decide what is right and what is wrong. That's the problem we've got.
It is. The Prime Minister isn't leading, and you're absolutely right. What we see on the streets now is social cohesion in this nation disappearing before our eyes, something that none of us want to see. And you look back and you're absolutely right at the bipartisanship which took place with ISIS. You know, the Intelligence and Security Committee, in the space of 6 to 9 months, put through 5 pieces of national security legislation to deal with it, all in a bipartisan manner, all led by the then Prime Minister. And what we're seeing now is nothing of the sort. And I think it's quite sad where our nation is heading at the moment, and it's going to require a principled leader. It's going to require a leader who will stand up for what is right. And we are very fortunate to have such a person in Peter Dutton leading the opposition. And I think there's going to be a huge contrast that the Australian people will be able to see in the two major leaders of the major political parties at the next election, one who will stand up for principle, one who is strong, and the other who sadly blows with the wind on an issue, speaks with forked tongue, and is showing weak leadership daily.
Dan, just quickly a comment from you, I've got to go, but this visa status, an American who's here says really offensive extremist things at a pro-Palestinian rally in Lakemba. The government says, we're going to review his visitor status. Why the heck isn't he already on a plane out of Australia?
Very, very good question. There's two questions that need to be answered here by Tony Burke. First of all is, why was he issued a visa in the first place? Who didn't do their due diligence about what this individual was already on the record saying about Hamas, a listed terrorist organisation? And then why is it taking so long now that he's said what he said for him to be removed from the country? Two excellent questions that Tony Burke needs to answer, and needs to answer tonight.